There's a small group of villagers in Uttar Pradesh who founded their own town called Azad Nagar in the year 2000 after they bravely raised their voices and stood up against their slaveholders. In today's episode of ThePrint's SoftCover, we'll be discussing a book that chronicles the journey of this group of villagers. I have with me the author of the book, Laura Murphy. The book that I'm talking about is called Azad Nagar, the story of a 21st century slave revolt. And like I mentioned, I have with me Laura, who is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice, Sheffield Hallam University. Welcome to ThePrint, Laura, and congratulations on your book.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be on the show.
To begin with, let's first unveil this book. I have it with me right here. Take the cover off.
I love that it's wrapped. I wish I could unwrap it.
Yeah, I'm doing it for you. Don't worry.
I love it. I love it.
Holding it up for our viewers here, it's a beautiful cover. It's called Azad Nagar.
It is a beautiful cover. The designer is brilliant. It's so
and I love the detailing around it, how it is talking about miners, these people who break rocks for a living. I think it's a beautiful cover.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. Jumping right in, Laura, now, of course, you're a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery, and you've spoken about modern slave narratives. That's what I found extremely interesting. Now, for the benefit of our viewers, can we begin with you talking a little bit about these narratives and modern forms of slavery, if you could give us a few examples?
Sure. So I guess to start with the concept of slavery, I guess, around the world, for unfortunately all of human history, there have been people who are willing to force people to work against their will, typically not paying them, and without allowing them to walk away, right? This is sort of the characteristics of slavery that have persisted over time and across geographies. It's existed in antebellum America, but it's also existed in Nigeria and, Iceland, all over the world. And, I have colleagues who believe that, we may be able to change economic realities and political realities in a way that we would see a future in which slavery doesn't exist at all. I have to admit that I'm not as optimistic about that. I think that unfortunately people are willing to exploit other humans. And we see this, as I said, throughout human history. But what we also always see, or what we often see, are the survivors of those experiences coming out and telling their story, wanting to have their story told, becoming activists in the effort to ensure that other people don't experience this, or that their families get free, or their communities also get free. And so that's what I'm most interested in, is those narratives that the people who are from that affected community themselves tell about their experiences, their lives. I'm also interested in the different other groups that might also want to tell those stories: nonprofit organizations, abolitionist groups, the slaveholders themselves, people who are community members who witness these things. So I'm interested in the way people narrate the experience of forced labor globally. And so this story really spoke to me.
Absolutely. And of course, you spoke about how people are willing to come out and tell their stories. Now, the book, of course, talks about a change in your perspective of the revolt when you finally visited Azad Nagar. It was a little different from the stories that were being told internationally, right? And I love the fact, just to compliment you, I love the fact that your approach is so layered when you, address this change in perspective, because one of the things that you talk about is that international organizations championed this as a non-violent silent revolution, even wanting to replicate this revolt in other parts of the world, whereas that exactly wasn't the case when we talk about Azad Nagar. Do you think this has to do with how we try to airbrush history sometimes to make it more palatable? Why can't we just allow these movements to be flawed sometimes? And why do we sort of feel the need to reduce these radical political movements into feel-good inspiration porn, so to say?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. I like your bold, directness about it, because I do think we need to be direct and explicit and honest about what's going on. So in Azad Nagar, the people had managed to overthrow the people who had for generations held their families in bondage. They had been working in a rock quarry and doing some agricultural work and often domestic work too for some wealthier families in their same town, and they eventually had put up with enough. There was sort of a peak of violence, and women were being raped, in particular by one man, and the families decided that was enough. They tried to appeal to government schemes in order to get a lease to their own quarries, and one day they had a sort of a run-in with the family members who had been oppressing them, and there was a revolt. And this is the story that had been told internationally about the success of this community, because while that revolt ended in them being exiled from having the powerful family burnt their village down, they ran into the night to escape this. There was a court case against them. Many of the men were arrested. Eventually they were freed. The men were freed. They built their own town, Azad Nagar, and got a lease to their own rock quarry. So this was like an international story about the success of impoverished people who are enslaved or in debt bondage, and who managed to overthrow the power scheme and take back the means of production and really engage in the economy. And they were engaging in politics. They were trying to elect one of their members. But when I went to visit, I found out that this story had elided one important piece, and that was that they had murdered the most violent of the men from the landholding community, and had maimed several others, and that had set them on a trajectory to being excluded, not for the kind of liberatory freedoms that they had expected or that we understood to be the case internationally, but that they had been excluded, that they had been punished for years, that they'd been in court cases for years, that they had not had gotten their entitlements, not gotten electricity, not gotten right. So I realized there was a different story there. And that different story was really about our celebration of nonviolent revolution, our rightful celebration of Gandhi, right? And that tradition internationally, that's important. But I think what we do when we only glamorize and valorize nonviolence is we ignore the very necessity of violence sometimes in situations where people have attempted to go through every official channel possible to get their rights and have been refused. And so they eventually, as a last resort, usually turn to violence. And that violence is not flawed, like you said, flawed. And I thought that was interesting. Like, that is not in itself a flaw. The flaw is that our systems do not respond to people who are being radically oppressed, right? That we do not act, that they could not get recompense through the official channels. And so we have a system that is terribly flawed, and this is true around the world, but it's particularly true for these people of the scheduled tribes in India. These folks could not get access to their rights. They reported these crimes to the police, and I looked at the police records, and there were no records of their complaints. But the only complaints that there were complaints from the landholding community against the tribal folks. So this was a real problem. And so when we look at this, when we look at violent revolution, we need to understand that violent revolution is a rational response to irrational violence, right? That the right to violence is given to the powerful and the rich and totally denied those who are not. But the other piece I would say is that the reason why we have to look violence in its face is because the consequences of violence revolution are different than the consequences of nonviolent revolution. And so when you give people the rights to the land and say, okay, great, you're good, and now we can walk away, you're self-sufficient, and don't recognize the difference between nonviolent and violent revolution and the repercussions within the community for that long term, we don't really give them sustainable freedom. They don't give them, they don't have access to sustainable freedom. And so we have to have a more robust response to that.
Absolutely. And you mentioned consequences of violent and non-violent revolution, the difference between them. Could you talk a little bit more about this? I found the premise very interesting.
Yeah, so the people of Azad Nagar, because they had committed violence in their movement in their movement to liberate themselves, they were not being given their Manrega rights. They were not being given the electricity they were supposed to get. They could see electricity being run to other communities around them, but they weren't getting, their road wasn't being paved when they saw other roads being paved. So they knew that they were being excluded because of their relationship to that event, even though it was 15 years later. And so they paid very high consequences because they continued to live in the vicinity of the people they had retaliated against. And so these consequences are different. And so I think that when nonprofit organizations, grassroots organizations like the ones that helped the people of Azad Nagar gain their liberation, understand their rights, help communities like that, they need to have a different plan for long-term stability, for mediation within the community between the parties, right? And that's probably true no matter what, because there still remains among the people of the landholding class a sense that times were better back when they had people who were forced to work for them, who were indebted to them. They have this paternalistic idea that they are strong and smart and capable, and people of the tribal communities are, essentially infants. They don't understand the world. They're not good at things. They they aren't educated. They can't really be capable of the things that the wealthier people in India, it's very caste based, of course.
Of course.
So the higher caste people have. And so those kinds of community relationships have to be mediated and worked through over time to create a more equal standing for people, even once people who've been in debt bondage have been freed.
Absolutely. Several ideas there, from sustaining the freedom to caste system, that I would want to talk to you about. But before that, so now there's another bit where you talk about, in the book, where you talk about the documentary that you first saw on Azad Nagar, which called it the happiest place in the world. Whereas that exactly wasn't true. You did speak about it briefly right now. Now, when you visited, they were, of course, still fighting institutional oppression and the system. Could you talk a little bit about how difficult sustaining such a freedom is, and if there are enough systems in place for providing additional support to such people who have just managed to set aside their fear of freedom, done the hard work of climbing out of that wall, but now just don't know what to do next?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked about that, because I think that people who have never been held captive in any way, forced to work or had any other kind of, domestic violence is similar. People feel like they can't walk away. Right. And if you haven't had an experience like that, you really have a hard time understanding it, I think. And I think a lot of people will say to me, well, why wouldn't they just walk away? Right? Why wouldn't they just get up and leave that quarry and say, I'm going to go, I don't have much of a house here. I'm just going to go build another, small house somewhere else. And this is not simply because, building a house is not possible. They could do that. They could probably find some land to live on and make that work, or work for some other more benevolent person. But what happens, I think, a lot, and this is what I learned from many of the people on the ground there, people who were themselves enslaved, but also people who were nonprofit workers in the region. What I learned from them was that people had this idea that it was their inherent status to be subservient to the people in the higher caste, and that they had that it was ingrained in their caste status also in their family history, also in economics, because they had, they would take out small loans, very small loans, minuscule loans that they would be told they had to pay off for decades. Sometimes children would be paying off the debts of their parents. So they believed psychologically, culturally, economically, even inherently, like spiritually, that they were subservient to these folks and their role was to serve them. And so walking away from that kind of a situation, that is not easy. That is not just a matter of packing your things and going, right? So what happens is that people have a fear of freedom. They're afraid not only of breaking the confines of that understanding of themselves, but also what will happen to them when they leave. How will they stand on their own? They have been told by the landholding class for so long that they are incapable, that they are children, that they are, that they have to have permission to do anything. And so that has become ingrained in their own psychology, and it's hard to break free of that. And so sustainable freedom is not just about moving one's body from one situation to another, right? And this is very clear because, for the most part, you sometimes see symbols of slavery being like chains and locks. People aren't chained up for the most part, right? That's not how this works. It's psychological chains, right? And so breaking those psychological chains does not happen overnight. Even in a moment of crisis like the one that happened in Azad Nagar, where they overnight changed the situation by having this revolt, their well-being, their long-term sustainable freedom, their ability to understand their role in life had to completely change, and needed significant support. And so that long-term support, I think, is one thing that we really miss out. And I see this all around the world. Even, I'm from the United States, in the United Kingdom where I work. We have very little information about long-term outcomes for people who've survived situations of forced labor or human trafficking or modern slavery. We have almost no evidence, no research on it, nothing sustained or systematic, and we do very little to help people beyond the first emergency moment when they escape a terrible situation. And that has got to change, because we can't celebrate these escapes to freedom unless we're actually going to make it possible for people to maintain that status and maintain that freedom.
That's extremely scary. Have you also seen instances where, because of this lack of support, once people actually have that psychological change, that they fall back into, say, a territory that's more familiar, which is enslavement? Does that happen?
Absolutely. This happens, and whether it's the case of the same kind of debt bondage or slavery, or whether it's some other form of exploitation or like lesser exploitation. A lot of times people who have been exploited for their labor will accept any job. Like they'll just, and look, this maybe has happened to you too. When I was in college, I didn't have any income. And so I took a job where I knew the boss was going to sexually harass me. I knew it. I knew it from the start, but I thought, I can take this because I need this job. I have got to pay my rent. I have got to find a way to feed myself. And so I just subjected myself to this man who I knew was bad, and I just tried to ignore it so that I could make enough money. And I was an empowered young person who, was in college, et cetera. So when we're talking about people who are the most marginalized in our societies and who have the least opportunity, who aren't in college, who don't have a family who can support them, things like this, a lot of times they will take those same risks because they'll think, well, it's at least better than the last horrific experience I've had. Absolutely. And so they'll have their wages stolen, or they won't get their rights, or they're just vulnerable to other forms of exploitation, including the extreme of enslavement. So one of the things I worry about the people in Azad Nagar is right now many of them are leaving that community to go work in big cities. So a lot of the young people want more opportunity, which is great. And this is an age-old story of people moving from rural areas to the cities. I did it to gain more opportunities. But these folks are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked or to being harmed as laborers. And the stories they told were actually quite positive in the work that they're doing right now, the people of that community. But it is a high risk, and it is always something we need to be wary of and be, like as a society, we need to be supporting people's, like having a living wage and having a healthy life long term.
No, absolutely. And the story that you shared with me, I completely get it, because despite the privilege that you and I come from, we still tend to expose ourselves to some level of risk. And for these people, the standards of these horrific experiences that they've experienced are much lower, I'd say. So that's completely valid. Now, we've spoken about the experience of this group of villagers, people of Azad Nagar. I'd like to now talk a bit about these slaveholders, the landowners, so to say. Now, this is again very interesting, where in the book you talk about the freedom from fear of freedom. One part was, of course, the fear of what newly free people may encounter, but there's also the bit about some people not even believing that they are enslaved, right? The psychological change that you talk about. Do you think that applies to slaveholders as well, where landholders in this case thought that they just didn't believe that they were actually enslaving someone? What was your experience of talking to them?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most important pieces of this work. As I was saying before, looking at this story from a number of different perspectives is critical. We have to.
I really appreciated that. That was one part about the book that I really admired, honestly. Sorry to cut you off.
Thank you. Yeah, no, not at all. I love this conversation. I think that we often just assume that people who do violent things are just simply evil. We sort of write them off and don't try to understand them or how they got to the place they're at or how they justify what's going on. And when we do that, we exonerate ourselves from actually addressing the core issues that make that kind of exploitation possible. And so, or make that kind of person possible. So if we just say those terrible slaveholders, which most people who write about enslavement do, they'll just categorize them as bad guys and focus on the lives and the voices of the people who survived enslavement. And that makes sense to me, focus on their voices, I focus on their story. But I wanted to talk to the people from the community who had been the ones who held these people in debt bondage for generations, and to understand how they understood this world. And, many of them understood this system to be beneficial to the marginalized, the coal people, the tribal people in this community. They believed that, as I said before, that they were incapable of taking care of themselves, and that their role as members of their caste was to take care of them. And it's a very paternalistic, infantilizing way of understanding a relationship with other people in your community, that they are inherently not capable, right? But they did believe this, and they believed that the debt system allowed them to have a free movement of resources where they were able to give them help from time to time, but still hold them responsible. And this is clearly problematic. But one of the people who had been injured in this melee was someone who firmly believed that without the debt structure of their relationship, that basically that the whole community had broken down. He had no responsibility to these folks anymore at all, that they were completely cut off from him, because if they weren't indebted to him, he couldn't fathom how they could be related in any way. On the other hand, there was another cousin from that same family who had recently become elected. There had been a series of very retaliatory relatives from that family who had been the pradhan in the village for years. But then another one of them got elected, who had traveled a bit more, who had a bit more of a perspective, it seemed, even from the viewpoint of the coal people, that a more of a perspective that they could get along together. And so he was working to try to heal the wounds of the community. But that was partially the case because they suddenly had a common enemy, right? So big multinational corporations had moved into the region and had taken over much of the land that was and they were mining it, doing large scale mining of the rocks that the landholders had previously profited from and the enslaved people had previously been working. So both of them had this complaint about these big companies. And so he was kind of bringing the community together in some ways around their opposition to the big corporations. So, and in the end, enslavement in that community was no longer profitable because they were no longer, the landholders at the time no longer had the rights to the rock quarries, were no longer doing that rock quarrying. And so in the end, like some of the rights that emerged for those communities and some of the healing that happened only occurred because the economic situation had changed such that the people of the landholding community needed the votes and the collaboration of the numerous coal people there.
Do you think that was a real change in mindset when you talk about this healing that happened when we speak of landholders?
I think, in terms of that small community, the mindset is changing. So one of the men who had been a central figure in the revolt from among the Azad Nagar families, he had recently been brought onto like the town council, and there was a little bit more representation, and this new Pradhan was really introducing a much fairer outlook. But I also would say across the board, over my time in studying this situation in India over the last 20 years or so, I would say that things have changed, that there's a mindset that has shifted. One of the stories that I think was cut out of the book was about a man I knew who worked in a hotel, who actually had land. He had a farm. It was his father's farm. And I don't think this got cut. You'll remember better than I do. You've read the book more recently. Okay. You don't remember this story. I think it got cut. And I really think it's an important moment. Okay. So I'm talking to this man in the hotel I was staying at, and he said that he owned farmland, and that was his land, but he didn't really like being a farmer. So he came into the city to work at this hotel every day, and he would go back at night and like pay the farmers, that the agricultural laborers who were working on his farm. And I told him what I was working on, and he said, "Oh, my dad never paid the workers." And I said, "Oh, really?" It's like, "Oh yeah, no one was paying their workers, in that generation, but I wouldn't dare not pay them. There are laws that explicitly say they have to get paid a certain amount. Sure, sometimes we take a little bit off the top for this or that, but I pay my workers." And it seems that there had been a mind shift from not even being able to conceive of paying them to not being able to conceive of not paying them. And so I do think that a lot of the social programs that have come through in the last 20 years, including Manrega, benefits, including payments going to people's phones, where people have phones, just sort of banking systems improvement. There are a lot of things that are they're corruptible. They don't always work, but they do. But they have changed. The number of girls I saw going to school in tiny villages, the number of young people going to school and not to the farms, I think has changed a lot in the last 20 years. And so I think there's reason to be hopeful, but I think there's a lot of work globally, not just in India. I want to always reiterate that that needs to be done to ensure that inequality is diminished.
Of course. My last question for you would be, now when we talk about revolt in India, just specific to India, this is about the Indian society. The Indian society is a bit more complex because of the prevalence of the caste system and how deeply it's rooted and affects people's lives. You've observed the situation very closely on ground, of course. How much of the blame would you put on the caste system for the forms of modern slavery that you've witnessed in India?
So I guess I wouldn't, I just, as an outsider, I don't think it's I don't think it's okay for me to sort of blame the caste system or any cultural construct, societal construct that is contributes to inequality. There are all, like I said, all over the world, there are ways that this gets configured, right? Okay. But I did see the caste system had such incredible prescriptive characteristics. Like, there were jobs that were only available to the people in the lowest rungs of society, and those jobs were easily exploitable, right? But then when like multinational corporations were coming into that region, they were bringing, the people who ran the companies were bringing in workers who were of the same high caste as the people who ran the company, but were manual laborers too. So there, I understand that there's movement, there's people aren't all high caste and therefore elites living in elite society. But when they hire other people, they displace the people of the local populations and the whatever castes may be, prominent in that region, and bring in folks that are from their own caste, creating an even greater inequality and a marginalization often of people who lived on the land for a really long time. And one of the things I do in the book is trace a history of that over hundreds of years, at how that kind of, that the prescription of who gets to have land and who gets to be in charge of these kind of large scale economic forces has often marginalized, especially the people of the scheduled tribes. And so that, I think, is truly a challenge that has a name and a way of describing and understanding in India that may be a bigger challenge in places where we don't name it as clearly. I don't know, right? But I do think that, right? Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I do.
Yeah, and so there's a way to address it by saying, okay, we have a name for this. How do we dismantle its unequal aspects? So, okay. But again, I don't want to prescribe anything for India myself from the outside. I'm a scholar of forced labor, not of caste, but I do think it is critical to this story and to the inequality. Yeah.
And that's fair. And I like how you've traced the history of the Coles, the people, the heroes in this book, so to say. On that note, we've reached the end of today's discussion. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thanks for having me. It was great to get to talk to you. And, I love your program. So this is great.
Same here. I'm holding the book up once again for our viewers. I hope you found the discussion interesting enough, because I did, interesting enough to pick this book up and give it a read. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.